Imagine being able to procedurally model, rig, and animate things, as well as have full procedural control over the whole thing. Want to change the model? That's good. Want to change the animation or individual parameters? No problem. Well, this does actually exist already, and it's called geometry nodes. Subscribe, join Discord. Let's go. Geometry nodes is a node setup which lets you procedurally model and animate your assets while allowing for exposed parameters, so you can change anything on the spot. Procedural meaning you can change anything you want on the fly, non-destructively, and the whole thing's gonna be responsive. As a very simple example, I can add a cube as my geometry input, give it enough subdivisions, and put instances on points. I'll explain how all of this works later, don't worry. I can use anything I want for these instances, so I can use the same cube, or even better, a custom cube model which already has bevels, because bevels look nice. For the scale, I'll use a noise texture so I can randomize it, clamp it down with a color ramp node, and set it to 4D so I can animate it. With a single slider, I can now do this. Geonodes. Set up some custom controls so it's easier to resize and make it denser, give the W value a hashtag frame driver so it's automatic, and now I have this abstract thing. I can expose these parameters so they're easily accessible and animatable without the need of the geometry nodes editor window thing. And the best part about this is I can change any of these settings and the whole thing is going to adapt. Without me having to mess with any of the animation data. Imagine making all this by hand. That'd be awful. Imagine changing things is just a nightmare. This is so much better. That is where the real power of geometry nodes comes into play. Not gonna lie, if you look at some of the best geometry nodes creations out there, I'm definitely not up there on the list. But I'm good at teaching things, and you guys voted for this, so I'll try my best to explain how the logic works so you can get the gist of what the workflow is like. But only if you subscribe. I'm not asking again. To start working with geometry nodes, select any mesh, curve, or text object in the scene, open the geometry nodes window and click New. This will create a new geometry nodes graph as well as add a new geonode modifier onto your object. You can also change them from the dropdowns just like with materials. Those two are the same thing. You get two nodes, which are your input geometry, which is your original mesh, and the output geometry, which is the end result. You don't need to start with your original geometry though, you can swap this out for anything, including other objects in the scene. So yes, you could put geonodes on a monkey and have it start as a cube, don't get confused by that. It's all about the input, where it starts from. Anyway, here you can add nodes that will affect your geometry before it reaches the output, like extruding faces, instancing, data extraction, and so much more. The best part is, you can change any of these values anytime you want, and it's still going to work, because underneath this procedural node tree, you still have the original geometry. So it's just gonna redo all the steps from the tree and update your end result, so it's all procedural and non-destructive. So here's the thing, geometry nodes are a very broad tool, and while I could sit here and tell you what each and every individual node does, I don't think I'd be showing you anything particularly useful, because their usefulness comes from the complexity of being able to stack them on top of each other and perform complex operations. So instead of giving you a lecture on every individual node, we will build a procedural sheet music generator with useful animatable parameters, and I'm hoping to teach you the logic behind the geometry nodes workflow along the way. It might get a little complicated as the final graph looks like this, but I'll be explaining every step of the way, so hopefully it's gonna be understandable. Let's begin. Let's take a look at the sheet music. It's got 5 lines, it's covered in notes, and the lines trim in and out as they wish. I think the best starting point would be a Bezier curve, because all the lines could follow the curve, we could easily extrude it and adjust it and shape it any way we want. So let's add a Bezier curve. I'll move its control points further apart so I have more space, and open the geometry nodes editor, where we'll add a new geometry nodes tree. Our input here is the original curve, and if you come to think of it, the lines are basically just a duplicate of the same curve stacked on top of each other and thick. So let's do that. I'll add a transform geometry node. This lets me move, rotate, or scale any geometry that I put into it, so I'll move it up by something like 0.2 or something. Then I'll add a join geometry node, which does what you expect, and plug both of them in. So the join geometry is now showing us the original curve, as well as the curve that's been moved up a little bit, so they're both being shown because they're both in the input. Makes sense. So I'll add another transform geometry node, set it to something like 0.4, and join that up in the join geometry as well. And for the last 2 lines, I'll go into the negative so the whole thing is centered, so minus 0.2 and minus 0.4. Now I have 5 lines, and they all follow the original Bezier curve. But what if I want to change the line spacing? What do I do then? What now? Am I gonna go in every single time and try to offset it manually, doing the math so the offset is relatively the same between all of them and stuff like that? Of course not, that's stupid. Why would you do it like that? We have the power of geometry nodes, okay? Don't forget that. Let's make it fancy and simple to use with a single slider. I'm gonna add a value node and set it to 0.2. This is gonna be our default one, and we'll add some math to get the values of all the other lines. and then by changing one, the math will automatically take care of everything else. But if I connect that into the transform socket directly, it's gonna offset it by 0.2 on the X, Y, and Z, so the line's gonna fly away. But I only want it to move on the Z axis. So we need to combine the X, Y, and Z inputs, and to do that, I'll add a combine XYZ node. This node takes 3 different values for the X, Y, and Z, and then just gives us a single vector output, which we can put in the transform. If I plug this value into the Z value and leave the X and Y at 0, and then plug that into the transform socket, the line is now where it needs to be, and I can control it with this value thing. And because we're using the combine XYZ everywhere, I'm just gonna duplicate this 3 other times so I have all of them here. Since we want a single slider to control all of this, we need to use the same value for 4 other sockets. So we'll add math to get the other values, and this one will control all of them, and they'll adjust automatically because of all the math in between them. So the top line is always going to be twice as much as this one, so let's just add a math node, set it to multiply, and multiply by 2. So no matter how much this value is, the top one is going to be twice as much, so it's always going to be the same. For the lower line, I'll multiply by -1, so it just flips it down, and for the lowest line, I'll multiply by -2, so it's flipped around and twice as strong. So when I slide this value, the lines are spacing apart because the math is mathing. Go figure. Congrats, you made your first geometry nodes control. Good job, I'm proud of you. However, we can go further than this. Our node tree now looks like this, just a refresher. I've organized it a little bit so it's not confusing. But like I said, we can make this value even more useful by exposing it, so it's accessible through the modifier stack. You can expose parameters by simply dragging them backwards into this open socket of the input geometry node. I'll disconnect this top Y value and plug it into the group input, and now it's created a new value. If you select the group input node, press N to see the sidebar and go into the group panel, you can now see the group sockets. I'll rename this Y by double clicking it and call it line spacing. I'll set the minimum to 0 so we can't go into the negatives, and set the maximum to 10 because I don't think I'll ever need anything above 10, that's pretty crazy. And I'll set this value back to the original 0.2 and plug it back into the Y. I'll also replace all the other values with the line spacing and just delete the value node because we don't need it anymore, we have this value now. And so everything is driven by this value now, and because it's plugged into the group input, it's now visible in the modifier stack. So you can change it from there anytime you want. In the group socket, you also have extra settings like changing the type, for example. You can make it a vector, integer, even a custom object if that's what your rig requires. You can give it a description, an attribute, change how it's displayed even, give it a default value or hide it, and so on. But we don't need any of that right now. We just have an exposed value that lets us change the spacing of the lines. Now let's make them thick, which isn't actually that simple because just adding a set curve radius isn't actually going to make them thicker. It just sets its radius property. If you actually want to make them thicker, they need a profile curve. It works the same way as any normal Bezier curve, where you have the main curve and a curve which is just for the profile. So thinking about that, we don't actually need 5 parallel curves. We need a single curve and a profile curve, which is just 5 circles stacked on top of each other. So we have one main curve, but the profile is 5 different curves. So those would get pulled along the curve, and we technically get 5 lines. So instead of the group input, aka my main Bezier curve, being fed into the transform nodes, I'm actually going to replace that with a curve circle node. Set its resolution as low as you can and set the radius to 0. I know we want circles, not dots, but we'll be converting this from a curve to a mesh and back several times. If you do raise the radius, you should see 5 little triangles, but put them back to 0. Just remember that the triangles are there. Now I'll add a curve to mesh tool, which will change curve information into mesh information. So every curve segment is now a vertex, and these are now edges. The reason I did that is because it gives me a profile curve input. So I'll plug my original curve into the curve socket and my infinitely small triangles into the profile socket. This also changes our transformation axis from Z to Y due to the circle's orientation. So change these. Again, if you raise the radius here, you'll see 5 triangular tubes going down, but put it back to 0. I just want you to know they're there because it's hard to see. Now, at any point that there's a triangle, you technically have 3 vertices in there because triangles are made of 3 vertices and they're scaled infinitely small, so there are 3 points there positioned in the same place. That could cause issues for us, so I'll add a merge by distance node, and this node will look for a threshold of range, and if it finds multiple vertices in the same spot, it's just going to collapse them together into one. Because all these triangles are on top of each other, they're automatically just going to collapse into a single vertex. For some reason, the curve is just now visible in the viewport. I don't know why that was not the case before, but at least now we see what we're doing. And because we use the circles as a profile curve instead of duplicating the main curve 5 times, this setup should now also work with the curve tilt. So it's going to respect your curve no matter what. But if you remember, we're trying to trim this curve from both sides, and we can't reasonably do that with a mesh whatsoever, so we actually have to convert this back into a curve, because curves have a direction and can be trimmed from start to end, while meshes have no such controls. So back into the curve we go. Add a mesh to curve node, and now every single vertex is now a point on the curve, and all the edges are now segments of the curve. Now we have the lines, they respect the shapes. Now the next step is make them trimmable from both ends. Yeah. This is hard. We have to trim the curves. I'll put this stuff in a box by selecting it and press Ctrl J and give it a custom color so it's organized. I'll give it a resample curve node to get back some resolution. This is now based on the Bezier curve's actual resolution, but when I place my curve, the Bezier handles won't be equally apart, so the curve isn't going to be equally dense everywhere. I want that to be the case, so I'll change this count to length, which will always make sure that the points on the curve are equally apart, and they're apart by this length amount here. So the curve is equally dense no matter what I do to it in the viewport, and that seems like a useful value to expose. This is the resolution of the curve after all. Drag this, plug it into the group input, call it curve resolution, and set the minimum to 0.01. Because if you go below that, it doesn't visually add any more resolution, but it's gonna lag your project, because that's a lot of points. So that should be the very max. Now I shall add a trim curve node. This lets me trim the start or the end of the curve. I'll leave this setting at factor because it works with any scale, and the trim is always going to go from 0 to 1, so it's like a percentage value. And now the trimming works, we can actually give the curve some thickness. So I'll once again use a curve to mesh node, this is a reoccurring theme I've noticed, and use a brand new circle curve as its profile curve. The reason I'm not reusing the old one is because I want different values here. Radius will determine the thickness, and the resolution will determine the resolution. I'm gonna drag both of these values into the group input to expose them, and we can change them on the fly. If you're worried about the tangled mess of node spaghetti, you can always just add a new group input, and it's gonna have all the same inputs as before. You don't have to rely on one, you can copy multiple of these, not to get stuff crossed. But now the lines are equally thick across the entire thing. I want them to kind of taper out, like fade out towards the end. So what can we do about that? First of all, how would we detect this? We need a value that changes along the curve. So the further down the curve it goes, the larger that value becomes. And we could use that value to drive the radius. Luckily for us, there exists such a value, and we kind of briefly saw it before. It's called factor. All curves have a factor, and the factor goes from 0 to 1. It's 0 at the start of the curve, and it slowly approaches 1 as it gets to the end of the curve. So if we can take this factor and remap it, so instead of from 0 to 1, it goes from 0 to 1 and then back to 0, and then use that value as our radius, the curve's thickness is going to go from 0, and then it's going to get thick at 1, and then towards the end it's going to go back to 0, so we get our taper effect. Let's do that. In between my trim curve and curve to mesh nodes, I will add a set curve radius node, because we need to do this before we convert a curve into a mesh. It's not going to work on a mesh. This now has an input for the radius, which can accept non-uniform values. The radius on the circle can't do that, no. Then I will add a spline parameter node, because that also includes our factor, which we're looking for. If I plug this into the radius directly, you can clearly see it go from 0 to 1. And it's also going to dynamically change if we extrude the curve or move the points. So this is very consistent. We need to remap this, but I'll do it visually because it makes more sense. It's easier to explain it to you guys that way. So I'll simply add an RGB curves node. This is easy. This is the start of the curve, this is the end of the curve, and this is the value. Right now it's going from 0 to 1, but if I grab this 1 and put it down to 0, they're now both 0. I'll add a new point in the middle and just bring it up to 1, so the middle is now 1, the ends are now 0. It's actually that simple. You can tweak this, you can change the handle type so it's more smooth, add more points if you want. Just make it look nice. This is your curve now. Now I'll box these to make it prettier, expose the curve start and end trims as well, so I have full control over this from the outside. You can try to play with the settings and the tilts and all that to see how it works, but we're actually done with the lines. The last thing we need is the notes and the materials. The problem with adding nodes is that they have to be equally spaced, properly oriented, scale in and out as the curve moves, as well as fly out of the curve as the curve disappears. This is probably the most complicated part of the whole setup, so I'll try my best to explain all the logic so you'll see how problem solving works with this workflow. So let's first tackle the distribution part. I'm thinking we take the original curve, then resample it so the lengths are equal, and then sample a random node on every single point. I think that's the way to go. So I'll take the original Bezier curve, run it through the resample curve node, set it to length, and put it to something small. I can also expose this parameter, call it node spacing, and I'm just previewing this by pressing Ctrl Shift and clicking. It's a Node Wrangler thing. You can edit preferences, add-ons, and search for Node Wrangler, turn it on. Now I got this. This way I can focus on what I'm working on right now and ignore what I've done before. After that, I will add an instance on points node, which will add an instance on every single point on the curve, and the instance can be whatever you want. You won't see anything by default because this is a curve, so we'll give it an instance. The instance being your nodes. Now, I'm not gonna make the nodes procedurally, because that sounds like a nightmare and a lot of work, and this video is long enough as it is. Instead, I've pre-modeled some basic node symbols made out of basic spheres and cubes with bevels and stuff, so we'll just use those. I'll put a download for the nodes in the description so you can use it yourself and follow along the tutorial. Or you could make your own. You can make your own. Stop stealing stuff. You leech. I put all of my nodes in a new collection called Nodes. And in Geometry Nodes, I'll add a collection info node, which allows me to bring this collection into my geometry nodes to be used in my setup. Select the nodes collection and plug it into the instance input on our instances on points node. You'll see a big mess because it's instancing the entire collection at once on every single one of these points. So to avoid that, we'll turn on separate children, which will turn every object in my collection into a separate instance rather than this whole thing being one instance. Then pick instance, so it will pick a random instance from the collection, which now means one of the objects individually. And finally, reset children so the position of those nodes don't have the world offset because they're not on 0, 0 in world space, so they snap onto the points where they should be. You can also turn the Z rotation around to align it to the curve, depending on which direction you've made your curve, but we'll have to fix this later to also include the curve tilt, because right now it doesn't do that. For now, just add a join geometry nodes and combine it with the lines we've made before, so now this is the whole thing. You can also increase the scale, but that will obviously be driven by the trims later and also expose parameters for more control, obviously. But for now, let's tackle the position first. Right now, all the nodes are at the same heights, while in actual sheet music, the height of the notes vary to depict the pitch of the note. I'm gonna add a set position node before the instances on points, so we can offset the curve points before turning them into nodes. The offset Z will move them up and down, but we obviously want this randomized, so I will add a random value node. Set it to vector so we get separated x, y, and z values, and set a minimum and maximum to the point where all the nodes cover the entire height of the lines. Now we have a bit of a problem when it comes to the curve tilt. You see, we're moving these nodes on the z-axis, while when you tilt, the z-axis kind of turns, you know what I mean? It has a local z-axis. So in order to get that local z-axis, we need to know the curve tilt, so how much it's tilting by, as well as the curve tangent to see in which direction the curve is going. So we need the tilt and the tangent, plug that into some fancy math, and we can find the direction of the z and then plug that into our offset. We need to use the tilt and the tangent before we've offset the points though. So we'll need to use the capture attribute node. What this node does is it basically looks at a certain attribute, the one you plug in, at this point in time. And then you can apply a bunch of stuff to it and then use the same non-modified attribute at the end of the chain. So it just stores it. It extracts it and lets you use it wherever else you want at this point in time. So add the capture attribute node right after we resample the curve. And we want to capture the point data, so leave that on point as well. The attributes we need to capture are the curve tilt and tangent. So I'll add the curve tilt and tangent nodes and connect them to my capture attribute node. This gave me two new outputs on the node, which are the curve tilt and tangent at this point in time. So after it was resampled, but before it was all offset. I've captured them, now I have them, and I can use these. Now to rotate the offset so it always matches the curve tilt, we'll need to do some vector math, which can get pretty complicated pretty fast, and it's a whole rabbit hole. So I don't really have time to talk about it in this video, but I can make a full separate video on vector math if you want me to. Let me know in the comments. If you don't let me know, I'm not really gonna make it because I'm just gonna assume you don't need it. But for now, you can just copy what I'm doing. Add a vector rotate node and have your random value be the vector input. This is the vector we're rotating to align it to the curve. Now the axis should be your captured curve tangent and the angle should be the curve tilt. Now they're gonna move with the tilt, but they won't rotate with it, so let's fix that as well. We'll add an align rotation to vector node, plug the rotation output into the rotation of the instances on points node, set the axis to X, and keep the pivot at auto. We've oriented to the tangent, here's the before and the after, but now we have to take care of the tilt as well. Duplicate the align rotation to vector node right after, set the axis to Z and the pivot to Y, because we just did the Y before. Now because our vector is set to 0, 0, 1, it will always point towards that, which is straight up. So a quick explanation of vectors, very quick. A vector has three values, which correspond with the x, y, and z axes. Imagine moving to these coordinates and point towards the final point from the start of the transformation. That is the direction of the vector. Our vector is always pointing directly up, but we need to tell it to point towards the curve tilt instead. So we'll add a vector rotate node before this. Our original vector is still pointing up, but we'll rotate it towards the curve tilt. So I'll add a vector node, where I'll put it to 0, 0, 1, so it's pointing up, and in order to rotate it towards the curve tilt, I'll plug our stored tangent into the axis and our stored tilt into the angle. So now that's what the nodes will be pointing towards. And lo and behold, the nodes now turn with the tilt. Congratulations, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Love you all. Mwah. I'll also box this with Ctrl-J so it's more organized and nicer to look at. This part was a little overwhelming because it was more advanced and requires some background knowledge on vectors and stuff. So don't beat yourself up if you didn't get it. This video was way too short for me to explain how everything works. For now, just copy what I did and let me know if you want a deeper tutorial on this. Your feedback is what drives this channel and the tutorials I make being voted in my Discord server. So feel free to join, the link's in the description. While you're there, subscribe. I lied. I will say it again. I will keep on asking because you don't do it. Look at this graph. I don't like this graph. Come on, people. I don't feel like it's efficient to get subscribers if you yell at them, so I'm sorry. Have a cookie. For real though, it does help me out a lot. Now, back to the video. Now, because the node's scale is also heavily dependent on the curve's factor in our trim, we'll also need to extract that, do some math logic, and then use that as the scale. Now, we could just add a regular factor node again, but I want to show you what's possible, so we'll do it a different way. I'll add a store named attribute node in front of the resample curve node, and we're storing the factor, so plug the factor into the value. Now, I'll give it a custom name. This could literally be anything you want, except for that. Don't do that. Please don't do that. Anything but that, and you can call back to it anytime you want, even in the shader editor, even in other parts of Blender, so it's not just limited to geometry nodes. You can extract this and use it anywhere else in the software. This is also why it's so powerful. I'm just gonna keep it inside geometry nodes though, so I'm just gonna call it trim. Then I'll add another node in a separate segment called named attribute. Set the name to trim, so this is basically our factor thing which we extracted. We could have added a regular spline parameter node and just use that factor because it is the same value. This is the one that we captured, but this way I get to teach you something new. Now let's think. We have a factor which is going from 0 to 1 along the length of the curve. We also have the trim start and end, which are also going from 0 to 1, and they also travel along the curve as the number goes bigger. And our node scale has to be 0 or close to 0 exactly on those trims. They can be bigger on the inside, but 0 on the trims and outside of those trims. What I'm thinking is we take the distance from both the trims to the factor and use that as a scale, because where the trim is on the factor, this is already 0 because the distance is 0, which means the scale is also 0, which makes the node infinitely small. When the trim is further away, the distance is bigger, which also means the scale is going to be bigger. So that kind of makes sense. Let's try it. I'll add a vector math node and set it to distance. Plug my trim attribute in socket 1 and the trim start from the group input into socket 2. If you were to plug this into the scale of the instance on points node, the nodes will be smaller at the trim and bigger away from it. I'll also add another vector math node, set it to subtract before that, so I can control the offset of that scale. Because I'm subtracting the trim value before I'm actually doing the distance calculation, so it's kind of offsetting where that is. I'm also going to add a combine XYZ node before that, drag the X into the group input and rename it to start offset, so I can control it. And obviously plug that back into all 3 sockets. I just did that so it's easier to control the value with one slider. If you're feeling fancy, you can shift right click drag them to combine them into a single reroute. Again, this is also a node wrangler thing, so turn it on if you haven't already. It's a great thing. Not using it should be illegal and I will personally fight you. So now you can control the offset of the scale, basically. But now as you move the trim start, the nodes get bigger again as the trim passes by. Because technically, the distance is now bigger, except it's now going into the negatives. So I'll add a map range node right after that. This lets me remap the value. Now the nodes are tiny right on the trim start, but big everywhere else. So I want to invert that. So I'll map from minimum 0 and maximum 1 to minimum 1 and maximum 0. So it's exact opposite. I flipped it around. The nodes are now only big at the start and small everywhere else. But because we have this node offset here, we can just move it so it looks fine. However, because the nodes are now very small, I'll change this minimum 1 into minimum 2. So now they're bigger altogether. If you mess with the from max value, you can increase the width of this band of scaled up nodes. If you want, you can create a new exposed parameter and call it expand start, so you can control the width of the start band. And now I'll redo this for trim end. Add a vector math node, set it to distance, plug in my custom trim attribute, and this time the end trim from the group input. Give it a scale vector math node, the combine XYZ, make it a new exposed parameter, call it end offset, connect to all 3 sockets, and finish everything off with a map range node with the same values as before. Expose the from max input, call it expand end. I found for me that it works best if I set the expand start to 1.4 and the expand end to something like 2.4. Your results might vary, but you have to do some tweaking to this after we're done, obviously. Just find the right values until it looks the best. Now each map range node works for one of the ends. Now we just have to combine them. We don't want to add them together because the middle, which overlaps, is just going to make the nodes even bigger and the ends will expand. That's bad. But if you multiply something with a value lower than 1, that value is gonna get smaller. This will eliminate the extending ends. We want to keep the 0 values from both map range nodes. So if it's 0 here, it should be 0 on the other one as well. But our maximum value nodes are 1.4 and 2.4. So multiplying those together would make the nodes even bigger in the middle. We can solve this by clamping the result. So anything larger than 1 is just gonna get clipped down to 1. So I'll add a math node, set it to multiply, and connect both map range results into it. Then tick on this clamp value. This gave us a band of nodes in the middle. Now you might think that's too short, but we can fix that as well. I'll add another multiply node and clamp it, so the nodes don't get too big. If this value goes above 1, the nodes that are smaller will get bigger, while the rest will remain the same because of the clamp, because 1 is max. This way you can sort of control the width of the node bands from both ends at once. I'll expose this value as well, call it expand both, so you have control of the start, end, as well as both at the same time. It will come in handy when you're making animations. Having more controls is always better, or you can simply not do that if you don't want to deal with that. I'm showing you how it's done, okay? And finally, I want a control of the overall scale of the node, so I'll add another multiply node, but this time, not clamp it. This value will now scale the nodes up and down, and because it's not clamped, it will allow values larger than 1, so, the nodes are gonna grow in the middle. So this is the overall scale control. Expose the value, call it node scale, and set the minimum to 0 because we don't want negative scale on the nodes. Whew, that was a lot of math, but I hope my explanations and visuals kind of make it easier to understand. I'm not sure, this is hard. If not, I encourage you to watch it slower, pause on the places where I'm going too fast, because I know that I speak very fast. But these videos could be like 2 hours long, I also don't want that. But now the final thing we have to do is make the nodes fly out as the sheet music disappears. We'll make them fly out as the nodes disappear and also slowly start floating up. We got this, we're almost there, just a little bit more. This is in addition to our node's position and is driven by the trim start value. The nodes are flying out on their local y-axis, flying up on their local z-axis, and they shouldn't move on the x-axis. Currently, our setup includes 2 random vector values, but we'll have to separate them because we need 3 different inputs. So combine XYZ nodes for both the minimum and the maximum, just like before. Make sure the Z value matches the one from before, so plug that in. Everything should remain the same when plugged in, we haven't done anything different yet. Now to add our floating out bits. The nodes will only fly out as the curve disappears, which is our trim start value. So this is a relationship between the overall curve factor as well as trim start, so we'll add both of those here. They clearly have to interact here for this to work properly. Our attribute called trim and a group input from the trim start. The start trim value is growing as we move the slider. So is the factor as we move along the curve. And so should our Z value with an offset. If we look at this from the perspective of the Z position, if we subtract the factor, a value that's rising along the curve, from the trim start value, a value that's uniformly rising as we progress, we should get a diagonal line which is slowly moving up. And if we clamp it so it can't go below 0, it looks like that line is rising from a point that's moving along the trim start. Sometimes it helps to visualize what these values are and what they're doing, and then it's easier to make the right call. So we'll add a math node, set it to subtract, plug the trim start to socket 1, and our custom trim value, which is the factor, into socket 2. Connect that into the Z inputs so we can visualize it. We still need to clamp it so it doesn't go down, so I'll add a map range node and maybe rise the 2 max value so nodes can go overall higher. I'll now add a math node, set it to add right after my subtract, and with this I can control the offset when the nodes fly up. Expose this value for more control, call it fly offset. And if you want to control the intensity, you can add a multiply node right after that. Expose that value, call it fly intensity. If you want to add a slight curve as the nodes are flying out, you can invert the custom trim value with a map range. Change from 0 to 1 to 1 to 0. And add another multiply node before the last map range node, and multiply what you got with the inverted factor. Because the start is now 1 and the end is now 0, multiplying with a smaller value will give you a smaller result, so it's naturally going to look like it's curving up. Now, if you remember, we had some height variation on the nodes, which is no longer there because we've overridden those values with what we just did here. What I will do is I will add 2 more math nodes right after our map range nodes. Put one to add and the other to subtract, and plug each into the map range outputs. Expose the value, call it node height, and use the same value in the other math node. This value will now control the height variations of your nodes. And I guess so we don't go through the same pain again for the y-axis, just to make it slightly different, because no one's gonna notice that it's any different, I'll just reuse this setup by duplicating the map range node and plugging it directly into the y input. It's going backwards, so I'll invert the map range node by putting a minus in front of the 2 max value. That's why I duplicated the node instead of just reusing the same one, because the value is different. The setup is now mostly done, but I want one final piece of control, and that is that I don't always want the same frickin' node layout. I want to be able to randomize the nodes, they're always the same now. The instance on points node has this little instance index input, which can be randomized to give you different seeds of the instances, which means random nodes. I'll add a random value node and this time set it to integer, which is what that green thing is. It doesn't accept any fractions, just accepts full numbers. Set the minimum and maximum to something like 1000. Connect the input into the instance index and drag the seed value into the group input to expose it. With this, you can now customize the node layout with a click of a button. Finally, you need to give this a material, and doing it the normal way won't work. The way you do this is create all the materials you want this thing to use. They don't even have to be on the same object, I just like to keep them there because it's more easily accessible. I'm gonna have my lines be one material, my nodes be another material, so I'll make 2 of them. Once I'm done, go back into geometry nodes. I'm gonna add a set material node at the end of the chain with the lines, and another set material node at the end of the chain for the nodes. Then pick the materials for both. Now open Shader Editor, you can edit the materials like normal and they're gonna affect your geometry nodes. I'll give the nodes a black material and the lines a shiny golden one. And now let's tackle this big old mess and make it more usable. As far as the graph goes, I'll add boxes to different sections and name them, so it's more clear what each part does, especially in the case if I ever want to come back to this in the future. The spaghetti can be organized with reroutes, and if you're really fancy, the whole thing could be leveled with straight lines. Insert OCD. Oh, I get it. As for the exposed parameters, you can also organize them. I'll click this icon up here and add 2 panels, which I'll rename to lines and nodes, and then drag and drop all the corresponding parameters into them. You can also rearrange them by dragging them up and down, and if you want to change the display for these types, say you want the trims to be shown as a percentage value, make sure to do this stuff now. And all of these values are designed to be single values. That means they don't really expect to be driven by an attribute, but rather just this single value in a box, so you can select them on the list and tick on single value to make this useless box disappear. And of course, do this on all of them because we haven't designed this in a way which would require that. And that is pretty much it. We've made a procedural sheet music generator which conforms to the Bezier curve, can be endlessly edited, works with the curve tilt, and has countless exposed parameters for endless customization. You've got the line spacing, line thickness, the line resolution, and of course the curve resolution. Just make sure you set the actual curve resolution really high. This will act like your maximum resolution, and the geometry node setup will just overwrite that. Then of course we got the trim start and end, which will nicely transition in and out randomly generated musical notes, which you can further customize. The start and end offsets of the note transition, start and end width of the note transition, or both at once, and the strength and offset of the flying out bit. All the while you have control of the spacing of the notes, the size of the notes, the height variation of the notes, as well as a random seed which spits out a different assortment of notes every single time. I can't think of a single thing we can still add to this, and I hope the explanation was understandable because I know geometry nodes can get a little abstract sometimes. They're not entirely my strong suit either, so if you want to see more tutorials, let me know in the comments and I'll try my best to make them. I'll say this again, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a video, and join my Discord server to chat with me in the community as well as vote for my future tutorials. That was a hard one. I am tired. Thanks again for watching, I'll see you next time and stay sharp.